Some memories never leave you, no matter how far you run. Daniel McCready learned this the hard way when he returned to his father's old veterinary clinic after 30 years away. He was just 12 when he watched his dad treat a sick farm dog. In this same dusty yard, the dog had strange lumps on its neck that kept growing bigger. She didn't expect him to go pale when he looked at her x-rays. There, deep inside her hand, were tiny brass gears and metal fragments that shouldn't exist in human flesh. The young doctor stared at the images in confusion, but Eleanor's heart raced with recognition. She knew exactly how those clockwork pieces got there, and remembering would force her to face a secret she'd buried for decades. What could make a grieving widow carry the remnants of her past literally under her skin? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor's Victorian house stood like a monument to time itself, its weathered blue paint peeling in long strips that curled like ancient scrollwork. 3 stories of gabled windows watched over Maple Street with the patient gaze of someone who had seen generations come and go. Inside, the house breathed with the rhythm of a dozen antique clocks, their synchronized ticking creating a symphony that had once comforted Eleanor, but now felt like a countdown to something she couldn't name. The morning light filtered through. Lace curtains that Herbert had hung 43 years ago, casting intricate shadows across the hardwood floors he had refinished with his own careful hands. Everything in this house bore his touch. The crown molding he'd carved during their 3rd winter together, the built-in shelves where his clock repair manuals still stood in perfect order, the kitchen window he'd enlarged so Eleanor could watch. The sunrise while brewing their morning coffee. But Herbert had been gone for 15 years, and Eleanor moved through their shared spaces like a ghost haunting her own life. She stood at the kitchen counter now, her right hand throbbing as she tried to grip her favorite ceramic mug, the one with tiny painted roses that Herbert had given her for their 1st anniversary. The mug slipped, clattering against the granite countertop, and Eleanor bit back a cry of frustration. The pain had been building for months, starting as a dull ache that she'd dismissed as the natural complaints of an aging body. But yesterday's visit to Dr. Martinez had changed everything. The x-rays lay spread across her kitchen table like evidence of a crime she couldn't remember committing. In the black and white images, her hand looked alien to her, bones outlined in ghostly white, but studded with dozens of tiny metallic fragments that gleamed like stars in a midnight sky. Brass gears no bigger than shirt buttons, delicate springs coiled like miniature serpents, and what appeared to be the intricate workings of a clock movement, all embedded deep in the flesh of her palm and wrist. Dr. Martinez had stammered through possible explanations, old shrapnel from some forgotten accident, perhaps, or metal fragments from a workplace injury, but Eleanor knew better. She recognized those shapes, those precise mechanical forms. They were Herbert's work, as distinctive as his signature. A knock at the front door startled her from her, brooding. Through the frosted glass, she could make out the slight figure of Lucy Chen, her 17-year-old neighbor, who had appointed herself Eleanor's unofficial caretaker since her own grandmother had passed 2 years ago. Lucy possessed the kind of persistent kindness that reminded Eleanor painfully of her younger self, before grief had taught her to build walls around her heart. Mrs. Graves. Lucy's voice carried the slight breathlessness that came from hurrying up the front porch steps. "I brought you some of Mom's soup. She made way too much again." Eleanor opened the door to find Lucy balanced precariously, with a covered pot in one hand and a paper bag in the other. The girl's straight black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her dark eyes held the kind of concern that made Eleanor feel simultaneously grateful and guilty. Lucy wore her usual uniform of jeans and an oversized sweater, but something about her expression seemed more serious than usual. "That's very thoughtful, dear." Eleanor stepped aside to let Lucy enter, noting how the girl's eyes immediately went to Eleanor's bandaged right hand. Though I've told you before, you don't need to check on me every day. I know I don't need to, Lucy said, settling the pot on the kitchen counter with practiced ease. But I want to. Besides, Mom says when people live alone, they sometimes forget to take care of themselves properly. Lucy's mother, Dr. Susan Chen, was a psychologist who worked at the regional hospital an hour's drive away. She had moved to Millbrook with Lucy after her divorce, seeking the kind of small-town peace that Eleanor had once found in this house. The Chens lived in the modern colonial next door, and Lucy had been drawn to Eleanor's Victorian from the moment they'd arrived. "What happened to your hand?" Lucy asked directly, her generation's straightforward approach to uncomfortable topics both refreshing and disarming. Eleanor hesitated. She had grown skilled at deflecting personal questions over the years, but something about Lucy's genuine concern made her usual evasions feel inadequate. "I had some x-rays taken. There's some old debris in there that's causing problems." "Debris?" Lucy's eyebrows rose. "Like glass or something?" "Something like that." Lucy studied Eleanor's face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read between the lines of adult conversations. "Mrs. Graves, you're not telling me everything, are you?" Before Eleanor could respond, another knock echoed through the house. This time the visitor didn't wait for an invitation. The front door opened with a familiar creak, and Frank Kowalski's gruff voice called out from the entryway. "Eleanor, I saw Lucy's bike outside. Everything all right?" Frank appeared in the kitchen doorway, his weathered hands already reaching for the tool belt that hung from his waist, even when he wasn't working. At 72, Frank retained the broad shoulders and steady hands of someone who had spent his life building and fixing things. He had retired from his job as a machinist at the paper mill 5 years ago, but retirement had only meant that he now fixed things for pleasure instead of profit. He had been Herbert's closest friend, the two men spending countless evenings in Eleanor's basement workshop, their heads bent over some intricate mechanical project, while Eleanor brought them coffee and listened to their animated discussions about gear ratios and spring tensions. After Herbert's death, Frank had continued to check on Eleanor with the faithfulness of an old guard dog, though she had made it clear that she preferred solitude. "Hello, Frank," Eleanor said, noting how his sharp blue eyes immediately focused on her bandaged hand. "Lucy was just bringing me some soup." Frank's expression grew serious as he took in the scene. Eleanor's obvious discomfort, Lucy's worried hovering, and the x-rays still spread across the kitchen table. He moved closer to the table, his trained eye automatically analyzing the images. "Jesus, Mary and Joseph," he whispered, his Polish accent thickening as it always did when he was surprised. "Eleanor, what the hell?" He caught himself glancing apologetically at Lucy. "What in God's name is this?" Eleanor watched Frank's face as he studied the x-rays, seeing the exact moment when recognition dawned in his eyes. His weathered features went pale, and he looked up at her with an expression of understanding and horror. "Those are clock parts," he said quietly. "Brass gears and springs. High-quality work." He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Herbert's work." Lucy moved closer to the table, her young eyes wide as she studied the images. "There are machine parts inside Mrs. Graves's hand. How is that possible?" Eleanor felt the weight of their combined attention like a physical pressure. For 15 years, she had carried this secret alone, but the pain had grown too strong to ignore, and now the evidence lay before them in stark black and white. "It was an accident," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "The night Herbert died, there was an explosion in his workshop, in the attic. I was hurt too, but the doctors at the hospital were so focused on Herbert that they didn't examine me thoroughly. I told them I was fine." Frank's eyes never left her face. "But you weren't fine. I thought the pain would go away. I thought—" Eleanor's voice broke slightly. "I thought if I ignored it long enough, it would just disappear like everything else from that night." "What kind of explosion?" Lucy asked, her scientific curiosity overriding her tact. "What was Mr. Graves working on?" Eleanor looked at the girl's earnest face, then at Frank's weathered features, and felt something inside her chest loosen slightly. These two people, one barely more than a child, the other carrying his own grief for Herbert, were offering her something she hadn't experienced in 15 years. The possibility of sharing the burden. Herbert was building something, she said slowly. Something extraordinary. We worked on it together for almost 2 years. It was going to be his masterpiece, a mechanical marvel unlike anything that had ever been created. What was it? Frank asked, though something in his expression suggested he might already know. Eleanor moved to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden, where Herbert's tool shed stood silent and empty. Above it, she could see the small dormer windows of the attic workshop, their glass dark and dusty after years of neglect. He called it the memory keeper, she said. It was designed to capture moments, precious moments, and preserve them in mechanical form. Herbert believed that love generated its own kind of energy, and that a sufficiently sophisticated clockwork mechanism could harness that energy to create something permanent. Lucy and Frank exchanged glances. To the teenager, this sounded like science fiction. To the old machinist, it sounded exactly like the kind of impossible project that Herbert Graves would dedicate his life to completing. The night he died, Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger as she finally began to share the story she had carried alone for so long. We were so close to finishing it. Herbert had been working 18-hour days for weeks, barely eating, barely sleeping. I begged him to rest, but he said we were too close to stop. He said... She paused, remembering Herbert's fevered excitement that last evening. He said it was going to be his gift to me, so that I would never have to be alone. The kitchen fell silent, except for the steady chorus of ticking clocks. Frank reached across the table and gently touched one of the X-rays, his calloused fingertip, tracing the outline of a brass gear embedded near Eleanor's wristbone. "Show us," he said simply. Eleanor turned from the window, startled. "What?" "Show us the workshop. Show us what Herbert was building." "I can't." The words came out more sharply than Eleanor intended. "I haven't been up there since I sealed it. Off after the funeral. The door is locked and I threw away the key." "Mrs. Graves," Lucy said gently, "you've been carrying those metal pieces in your hand for 15 years. Don't you think it's time to find out why?" Eleanor looked at these two people who had forced their way past her carefully constructed defenses with nothing more than persistent kindness and genuine concern. Frank, with his practical wisdom and gentle strength. Lucy, with her youthful courage and unshakable faith that problems could be solved if you just looked at them straight on. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to slant through the maple trees that gave their street its name, casting long shadows across the garden where she and Herbert had planted their first roses. The house around them continued its steady mechanical breathing, each clock marking time with the precision that Herbert had devoted his life to perfecting. Maybe it was time to stop running from the past. Maybe it was time to discover what Herbert's final gift was supposed to be. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll show you the workshop, but first I need to find another key." She moved to the kitchen drawer where she kept her spare keys, her bandaged hand fumbling with the handle. Behind her, she heard Frank and Lucy speaking in low tones, but their words were lost beneath the sudden acceleration of her heartbeat, and the phantom sound of clockwork that had haunted her dreams for 15 years. It was time to return to the place where everything had ended, and perhaps where something new might begin. Eleanor stood at the bottom of the narrow staircase that led to the attic, her hand wrapped around a brass key that felt heavier than its actual weight. The key had been hidden in Herbert's desk drawer, wrapped in a piece of old cloth and tucked behind a stack of clock repair receipts from 1987. She had found it there 20 minutes ago, after tearing apart the desk with a desperation that surprised her. Frank climbed the stairs ahead of her, his flashlight beam dancing across walls that hadn't seen light in 15 years. Lucy followed close behind Eleanor, her young presence both comforting and unsettling. Eleanor couldn't help but think that Lucy was roughly the same age Eleanor had been when she first met Herbert, full of curiosity and unafraid of the unknown. The attic door stood before them like a portal to another life. The heavy oak panel bore scorch marks around its edges, black stains that spoke of fire and smoke and things gone terribly wrong. Eleanor had painted over the marks years ago, but they had bled through the new paint like a wound that refused to heal. "Are you sure about this?" Frank asked gently, his hand resting on the door handle. "We can come back another time if you need more." "No." Eleanor's voice was steadier than she felt. "If I don't do this now, I never will." She inserted the brass key into the lock with trembling fingers. The mechanism turned with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting patiently all these years for her return. The door swung open with a soft creak, releasing a wave of stale air that carried the phantom scents of brass polish, machine oil, and something else, something sweet and indefinable that made Eleanor's chest tighten with recognition. Frank's flashlight beam swept across the workshop, illuminating a space that time had frozen in amber. Dust motes danced in the light like tiny spirits, and cobwebs draped the corners like mourning veils. But beneath the neglect, Herbert's workshop remained exactly as he had left it on that final night. Workbenches lined 3 walls, their surfaces covered with precision tools that gleamed despite the dust. Hand-forged hammers hung from pegboards in perfect rows. Calipers and micrometers waited in their designated places like soldiers at attention. Glass jars filled with screws, springs, and gears created a rainbow of brass and silver along the shelves. But at the center of the room, draped in a white sheet like a ghost, stood the thing that had consumed the last 2 years of Herbert's life. "Mother of God," Frank whispered, moving closer to the covered form. "Look at the size of it." Even shrouded, the machine commanded attention. It rose nearly 6 feet from the floor, its shape suggesting something between a grandfather clock and an elaborate mechanical sculpture. Brass fittings gleamed beneath the sheet where the fabric had pulled tight, and the overall form had an organic quality that made it seem almost alive. Lucy approached from the other side, her eyes wide with fascination. "Mrs. Graves, this is incredible. How did Mr. Graves build something this big without anyone knowing?" Eleanor moved closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He worked at night mostly, and he was very good at keeping secrets." She reached toward the sheet with her good hand, then stopped. "I haven't looked at it since that night. I don't know if I can." "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," Frank said quietly. "But Eleanor, this might be important. For your hand, I mean. Maybe understanding what Herbert was building will help us figure out how to help you." Eleanor took a deep breath and grasped the edge of the sheet. "Together," she said. "We'll look at it together." Frank and Lucy each took hold of a corner, and on Eleanor's count they pulled the covering away. The memory keeper stood revealed in all its impossible complexity. The base was carved from a single piece of dark walnut, its surface inlaid with spiraling patterns of brass and silver that seemed to move in the flashlight's beam. From this foundation rose a central column, composed of hundreds of interlocking gears, each one crafted with the precision of a master watchmaker. The gears increased in size as they ascended, creating a graduated tower that culminated in a crystal dome at the machine's apex. But it was the details that took Eleanor's breath away. Miniature clockwork figures danced around the central column. A bride and groom, no bigger than Eleanor's thumb, their faces carved with such delicate precision that their expressions seemed to shift in the moving light. Tiny mechanical birds, perched on brass branches that sprouted from the main assembly, their wings poised for flight, and woven throughout the entire structure were what appeared to be crystal threads, so fine they were nearly invisible, connecting each component in an intricate web of light and motion. Lucy circled the machine slowly, her photographer's eye cataloguing every detail. "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she breathed. "It's like a clock and a music box and a sculpture all at the same time." Frank knelt beside the base, his trained eye examining the mechanical connections. "The precision here is extraordinary. I've never seen gear work this fine, even in the best Swiss movements." He looked up at Eleanor with something approaching awe. "How long did Herbert work on this?" 2 years, Eleanor replied, her voice distant as memories flooded back. "But he'd been planning it for much longer. He used to sketch ideas in the margins of his repair manuals, little mechanical drawings that never seemed to add up to anything. Then one day he showed me a complete blueprint, rolled out across our dining room table like he was planning to build a house." She moved closer to the machine, her eyes tracing the familiar curves and angles. "He said it was going to be his gift to me for our 40th anniversary, a way to preserve all our best moments so I could visit them whenever I wanted." Her voice caught slightly. "He said he never wanted me to feel alone." Frank stood slowly, brushing dust from his knees. "Eleanor, what exactly was this thing supposed to do?" Eleanor closed her eyes, remembering Herbert's fevered explanations during those final weeks. He believed that strong emotions, especially love, generated a kind of energy that could be captured and stored. The memory keeper was designed to absorb that energy during significant moments and then replay them in mechanical form. "Like a recording?" Lucy asked. "More than that?" Herbert thought it could create a kind of temporal echo, a way to actually step back into preserved moments and experience them again. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at the machine with a mixture of wonder and fear. "He said the crystal threads would capture not just images and sounds, but feelings, scents, even the quality of light during precious moments." The workshop fell silent as they absorbed this information. Outside, evening was approaching, and the slanted light from the dormer windows cast long shadows across Herbert's tools and blueprints. Frank cleared his throat. "Eleanor, what happened the night Herbert died? You said there was an explosion." Eleanor sank onto a dusty stool beside one of the workbenches, her right hand throbbing as the memories surfaced. "We were so close to finishing it. Herbert had been working day and night for weeks, barely eating or sleeping. I was worried about him, but he kept saying we couldn't stop, not when we were so close." She gestured toward the machine's crystal dome. That was supposed to house the central processor, a kind of crystalline heart that would coordinate all the memory keeper's functions. Herbert had been growing the crystal himself, using some process he'd learned from an old German clockmaker. It took months to get it right. Lucy perched on another stool, leaning forward with rapt attention. "What went wrong?" "The crystal was unstable. Herbert knew it, but he thought he could stabilize it during the installation process. He was so excited that night. He kept saying we were about to make history, that we were going to change how people thought about love and memory. And time itself." Eleanor's voice grew quieter as she continued. "I was helping him position the crystal in its housing. It was beautiful, clear as diamond but warm to the touch, and it hummed with this strange inner vibration. Herbert said it was resonating with the emotional energy we'd put into building the machine." Frank moved closer, his expression grave. "What happened when you installed it?" "It worked," Eleanor said simply. "For about 30 seconds it actually worked. The whole machine came alive, gears turning, crystal threads lighting up like fiber-optic cables, and the little figures beginning to move in this incredible dance. I could hear music, but not with my ears. It was coming from inside my chest, like the machine was playing my heartbeat back to me." She lifted her bandaged hand, staring at it as if she could see through the bandages to the brass fragments beneath. But then something went wrong. The crystal began to overheat, and Herbert realized it was going to explode. He pushed me away just as it detonated. The workshop seemed to hold its breath as Eleanor's words hung in the air. I was thrown across the room. When I came to, Herbert was... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. My hand was full of metal fragments, and the machine was dark and silent. I couldn't bear to look at it after that. It represented everything we'd lost. Lucy wiped tears from her eyes. "Mrs. Graves, I'm so sorry." Frank walked around the machine slowly, his experienced eyes examining its construction. "Eleanor, I hate to ask this, but Where's the crystal housing now? Eleanor pointed to the top of the machine, where the crystal dome sat empty and dark. Herbert's crystal was destroyed in the explosion. Without it, the memory keeper is just an elaborate sculpture. But the machine itself wasn't damaged, Frank pressed. Not significantly. The explosion was contained within the crystal housing. Herbert designed it that way as a safety measure. Eleanor stood slowly, moving closer to Frank. Why do you ask? Frank ran his hands along the machine's base, feeling for hidden switches or controls. Because if the machine was functional for 30 seconds, then Herbert succeeded. The basic design works. We just need to find a way to replace the crystal. Lucy joined them beside the machine, her young face bright with possibility. Could we build a new crystal, or find someone who knows how to make one? Eleanor shook her head. Herbert never told me exactly how he grew it. His notes were destroyed in the explosion. Frank smiled grimly. Then we'll have to figure it out ourselves. As if responding to their conversation, one of the machine's gears gave a soft click, rotating slowly through a quarter turn before falling silent again. All three of them froze, staring at the mechanism. Did it just? Lucy began. Another gear moved, this one lower in the assembly, its brass surface catching the last rays of sunlight from the dormer windows. Then another and another, until a slow cascade of mechanical motion was working its way through the entire machine. Eleanor stepped backward, her face pale. That's impossible. Without the crystal, it shouldn't be able to move at all. But the memory keeper continued its slow awakening, gears turning with deliberate purpose, crystal threads beginning to glow with a faint inner light. And from somewhere deep within its mechanical heart came a sound that made Eleanor's breath catch, the soft, familiar rhythm of a heartbeat that wasn't quite her own. The machine was trying to complete itself, reaching out across 15 years of silence to touch the woman who had helped create it. And in her right hand, the brass fragments began to warm against her bones, responding to the call of their mechanical home. Frank grabbed Eleanor's arm as she swayed on her feet. Eleanor, are you all right? She stared at the slowly moving machine, her eyes wide with recognition and terror. It remembers, she whispered. After all these years, it still remembers. The memory keeper's gentle mechanical song filled the dusty workshop, and Eleanor realized that returning to this place hadn't been about confronting the past. It had been about discovering that the past had been waiting patiently for her return. The next morning found Frank hunched over Herbert's journal at Eleanor's kitchen table, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he struggled to decipher the clockmaker's intricate handwriting. Eleanor had retrieved the leather-bound book from Herbert's desk the night before, after they had finally left the workshop with more questions than answers. The memory keeper had continued its slow, hypnotic movements for nearly an hour before gradually falling silent again, leaving all three of them shaken and wondering what they had witnessed. Listen to this, Frank said, running his finger along a page filled with Herbert's careful script and detailed mechanical drawings. Entry dated March 15th, 2 years before he died. The theoretical framework continues to solidify. Love generates its own temporal field, measurable in microcronons per emotional unit. Eleanor's presence during testing increases resonance by 47%. The crystal must be grown in an environment of sustained affection to achieve proper harmonic alignment. Lucy looked up from her position on the floor, where she had spread out photocopies of Herbert's technical drawings like pieces of a massive puzzle. Microcronons? Is that a real unit of measurement? Not that I know of, Frank replied. But Herbert was always inventing his own terminology for things that didn't have names yet. He flipped to another page, this one marked with small brass gear sketches in the margins. Here's something interesting. The memory keeper requires more than mechanical precision. It needs emotional calibration. Each component must be crafted with intention, with love infused into the metal itself. The machine doesn't just store memories, it stores the feelings that give memories their power. Eleanor sat in her chair by the window, watching Frank and Lucy work while nursing her third cup of coffee. Her right hand felt strange this morning, not painful exactly, but warm and somehow more alive than it had been in years. The brass fragments seemed to pulse gently against her bones, keeping time with her heartbeat in a way that should have been disturbing but somehow felt natural. "What does he mean by emotional calibration?" she asked. Frank turned several pages, scanning Herbert's notes for relevant passages. "Here. He writes about it extensively. Traditional clockwork operates on purely mechanical principles: tension, release, rotation, regulation. But the memory keeper must respond to emotional resonance as well. Each gear must be attuned to specific frequency ranges of human feeling. Joy operates at a different harmonic level than sorrow, love at a different frequency than fear." Lucy stood up, brushing dust from her jeans. So he wasn't just building a clock, he was building something that could sense and respond to emotions. It sounds impossible," Eleanor said quietly, "but then again, so did the idea of powered flight once upon a time." Frank closed the journal and removed his glasses, rubbing his tired eyes. "Eleanor, I've been thinking about what we saw last night. The machine responded to your presence. It started moving again after 15 years of silence. And your hand, you said the metal pieces have been warming up?" Eleanor nodded reluctantly. "It started when we uncovered the memory keeper. The fragments feel active somehow, like they're trying to reconnect with something." "Show me," Frank said gently. Eleanor hesitated, then began unwrapping the bandages Dr. Martinez had applied. Underneath, her palm looked surprisingly normal. No visible wounds or scars marked the skin. But as she flexed her fingers, they could all see subtle movements beneath the surface, as if tiny mechanisms were shifting and realigning themselves. Lucy moved closer, her eyes wide with fascination rather than revulsion. "It doesn't look painful." "It's not anymore," Eleanor admitted. "For 15 years, those fragments felt like shards of glass embedded in my flesh. But since yesterday, they feel more like they belong there." Frank reached across the table and gently took Eleanor's hand in his weathered palms, examining it with the careful attention he had once given to delicate clockwork. "May I?" When Eleanor nodded, he pressed softly against her palm, feeling for the shapes beneath her skin. "Remarkable," he murmured. "I can feel them moving, actually repositioning themselves. Eleanor, I think those fragments are trying to form some kind of pattern or configuration." "What kind of pattern?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the subtle bumps and ridges in Eleanor's palm. "It feels like a circuit of some kind, or maybe a key." Lucy leaned over the table, studying one of Herbert's more complex diagrams. "Mrs. Graves, look at this drawing. It shows the memory keeper's control interface, the way someone would operate the machine. But there's no keyboard or buttons or anything like that." Eleanor and Frank examined the diagram Lucy was pointing to. It showed a detailed cross-section of the memory keeper's base, with intricate internal mechanisms and connection points clearly marked. But the operational interface appeared to be nothing more than a smooth brass panel with a palm-shaped indentation. "A hand interface," Frank said slowly. "The operator would place their hand against this panel to control the machine." "But how would that work?" Lucy asked. Eleanor felt a chill of recognition as she studied the drawing more carefully. "The brass fragments," she said quietly. "They're not just random pieces of Herbert's work. They're components of the control interface. When the crystal exploded, some of its programming matrix must have been embedded in my hand along with the metal fragments." Frank looked up from the diagram, his expression grave. "Eleanor, are you saying that you've been carrying part of the memory keeper inside you for 15 years? "I think so. And I think Herbert knew it would happen." Lucy frowned. "What do you mean?" Eleanor stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the garden where she and Herbert had spent so many peaceful mornings. Herbert was always paranoid about his inventions being stolen or misused. He built safeguards into everything he created, hidden Mechanisms that would prevent his work from falling into the wrong hands. She turned back to face Frank and Lucy, her expression troubled. What if the explosion wasn't an accident? What if Herbert realized the crystal was unstable and deliberately detonated it, knowing that the only way to protect the memory keeper was to make sure its control system could only be operated by someone he trusted completely? Frank sat down. Herbert's journal, his face pale. You think he sacrificed himself to turn you into a living key for his machine. I think he sacrificed himself to protect something he believed was too important and too dangerous to leave unguarded. Eleanor's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. And I think he trusted me to decide when the world was ready for the memory keeper. Lucy looked between Eleanor and Frank, processing this revelation. But if that's true, then you could operate the machine right now, couldn't you? The control interface is literally part of you. Eleanor nodded slowly. Theoretically. But without a new crystal to power the central processor, it would just be an elaborate puppet show. Frank reopened Herbert's journal, flipping through pages with renewed urgency. Then we need to figure out how Herbert grew his crystal. There have to be notes somewhere, recipes, procedures, something we can follow. I already looked, Eleanor said. His crystal-growing notes were kept in a separate notebook, and that was destroyed in the explosion. Then we'll have to work backward. From the machine itself, Frank said stubbornly. Study the crystal housing, analyze what's left of the mounting system, figure out what properties the crystal needed to have. Lucy was already gathering up the photocopied drawings. I can help with research. My mom has access to university databases through her work. Maybe we can find information about crystal growth techniques, harmonic resonance, emotional frequency mapping, whatever we need to understand. Eleanor watched these two people, one old enough to be her peer, one young enough to be her granddaughter, as they threw themselves into solving Herbert's puzzle with the same passion that had once driven her husband. Part of her wanted to stop them, to protect them from the obsession that had consumed Herbert's final years. But another part, the part that still carried Herbert's dreams embedded in her very flesh, whispered that perhaps it was time to finish what they had started. All right, she said finally, we'll try to complete Herbert's work, but I need you both to understand something first. Frank and Lucy looked at her expectantly. Herbert believed the memory keeper could be the most important invention in human history, a way to preserve love and wisdom across generations, to let people share their most precious moments with those they cared about. But he also believed it could be incredibly dangerous in the wrong hands. Eleanor held up her hand, flexing her fingers so they could see the subtle movements of the brass fragments beneath her skin. This isn't just about building a machine. This is about deciding whether humanity is ready for the ability to preserve and share perfect memories of love. And if we succeed, if we actually complete the memory keeper, we'll be responsible for and how it's used. Frank nodded gravely. Herbert chose well when he made you the guardian of his secret. Lucy looked thoughtful. Mrs. Graves, what would happen if we finished the machine but decided the world wasn't ready for it yet? Eleanor smiled at the girl's wisdom. Then we would do what Herbert did. We would protect it until the right time comes, even if that means waiting another 15 years. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher above the maple trees, casting shifting patterns of light across Herbert's journal and the scattered drawings that held the secrets of the memory keeper. In the distance, the church bells chimed 10 o'clock, their bronze voices joining the symphony of ticking clocks that filled Eleanor's house with the steady rhythm of measured time. But in Eleanor's right hand, the brass fragments pulsed with a different rhythm entirely, the rhythm of a heart that had stopped beating 15 years ago but had never stopped loving. 3 days later, Eleanor found herself standing in front of her bedroom mirror at dawn, staring at her wedding ring with a mixture of wonder and growing unease. The simple gold band that Herbert had placed on her finger 43 years ago was behaving in ways that defied every law of physics she understood. It had started the previous evening, when she had returned to the workshop to take measurements of the memory keeper's crystal housing. The moment she stepped within 3 feet of the machine, her wedding ring had begun to vibrate, not visibly, but with a subtle harmonic resonance that she could feel in her bones. By the time she left the attic, the ring was noticeably warm, against her skin. Now, in the pale morning light, she could see that the gold band was actually glowing with a faint inner radiance, as if someone had embedded tiny LEDs within the metal itself. She tried removing the ring, but the moment it left contact with her skin, the glow faded and the strange vibrations stopped entirely. When she slipped it back onto her finger, the phenomena resumed immediately. Eleanor had worn this ring every day for over 4 decades. She knew its weight, its temperature, the way it caught light and cast shadows. But the ring on her finger now felt different, denser somehow, as if it contained more than just gold and memory. A soft knock at her front door interrupted her contemplation. Through the frosted glass, she could see Lucy's familiar silhouette, arms laden with what appeared to be library books and computer printouts. "Mrs. Graves," Lucy called, "I brought coffee and research materials, and I think I might have found something important." Eleanor opened the door to find Lucy practically vibrating with excitement, her dark eyes bright with the thrill of discovery. The teenager had thrown herself into researching the memory keeper with the intensity that only the young could sustain, spending hours online and at the regional library, following obscure references and theoretical papers that most people would have dismissed as science fiction. "You look like you haven't slept," Eleanor observed, noting the coffee stains on Lucy's sweater and the slight tremor in her hands that came from too much caffeine and too little rest. "Sleep is overrated when you're on the verge of a breakthrough," Lucy said, bustling past Eleanor into the kitchen. "Mrs. Graves, I found references to crystal growth techniques that match some of the descriptions in Mr. Graves's journal. And more importantly, I found other people who've attempted similar projects." Eleanor followed Lucy into the kitchen, where the teenager began spreading papers across the table with the systematic efficiency of a scholar. "Other people? What do you mean?" "I mean, Herbert wasn't the only person trying to build emotion-responsive technology." Lucy pulled out a thick folder filled with printed articles and handwritten notes. "There's a whole underground community of researchers working on what they call affective engineering, technology that responds to human emotions and psychological states." Eleanor sat down heavily, suddenly feeling every one of her 78 years. "Lucy, please tell me you haven't been contacting these people." "Not yet," Lucy said quickly, seeing Eleanor's alarm. "But Mrs. Graves, some of their research could help us understand how to complete the memory keeper. Look at this." She pulled out a scientific paper titled "Crystalline Matrices for Emotional Resonance Storage" and pointed to a section highlighted in yellow marker. "This researcher in Switzerland has been growing crystals that can store and replay emotional imprints. She's published papers about it in legitimate scientific journals." Eleanor scanned the abstract, her eyebrows rising as she took in phrases like affective crystallography and temporal emotion mapping. "This sounds like Herbert's work, but approached from a completely different angle." "Exactly. And look at this one." Lucy produced another paper, this one from a Japanese research institute. "They've been working on mechanical systems that respond to bioelectric fields generated by strong emotions. Their test subjects can control simple machines just by focusing on specific memories or feelings." Frank's voice came from the kitchen doorway, where he stood holding his morning coffee and looking distinctly rumpled. "Did someone say bioelectric fields?" "Frank." Eleanor rose to pour him coffee. "How long have you been listening?" "Long enough to hear that Lucy's been burning the midnight oil again." Frank settled into his usual chair and accepted the coffee gratefully. "What's this about other researchers?" Lucy launched into an enthusiastic explanation of her findings, spreading papers and printouts across the table like a detective presenting evidence. Frank listened with the patient attention of someone who had spent decades solving complex mechanical problems, occasionally asking for clarification or requesting to see specific documents. "This is remarkable work," he said finally. "But Lucy, these researchers are working with relatively simple systems, crystals that can store basic emotional patterns, machines that respond to focused thought. What Herbert was attempting with the memory keeper was orders of magnitude more complex." "I know," Lucy said, "but the underlying principles are the same, and some of these papers include detailed protocols for crystal growth that we could adapt." Eleanor had been listening to their conversation while studying her wedding ring, which continued to pulse with that strange inner light. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something I should probably tell you both." Frank and Lucy turned, their attention to her expectantly. Eleanor held up her left hand, showing them the glowing ring. "This started yesterday when we were in the workshop. My wedding ring is responding to the memory keeper somehow." Lucy leaned forward, her eyes widening as she took in the ring's subtle radiance. "Mrs. Graves, that's incredible. How is it even possible?" Frank reached across the table, gently taking Eleanor's hand to examine the ring more closely. "May I?" When Eleanor nodded, he held her hand up to catch the morning light streaming through the kitchen window. "Eleanor," he said slowly, "this isn't just your wedding ring anymore." "What do you mean?" Frank turned Eleanor's hand carefully, studying the ring from different angles. "Look at the band itself. The gold has been modified somehow. There are microscopic filaments running through it, threads of something that looks like the same crystal material Herbert used in the memory keeper." Eleanor stared at her ring with growing understanding. "Herbert did this, didn't he? He modified my wedding ring to interact with his machine." "When?" Lucy asked. Eleanor closed her eyes, thinking back to the weeks before Herbert's death. "He asked to clean my ring about a month before the accident. Said it needed professional attention, that the gold was getting tarnished. He kept it for 3 days. Frank released Eleanor's hand and sat back in his chair. "He was preparing you, Eleanor. Not just embedding control circuits in your palm. He was turning your wedding ring into a component of the memory keeper itself." The kitchen fell silent as they absorbed this revelation. Outside, the morning sounds of Millbrook continued, birds calling from the maple trees, distant traffic, a neighbor starting their lawnmower. But inside Eleanor's house, the steady ticking of Herbert's clocks seemed to grow louder, more insistent. "What does this mean?" Eleanor asked finally. Lucy consulted one of her research papers. "According to this study on emotional resonance amplification, certain metals can be treated to enhance their responsiveness to bioelectric fields. If Mr. Graves modified your ring with crystal filaments, he might have created a kind of emotional antenna." "An antenna for what?" Frank leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "For the machine to read your emotional state. Eleanor, I think your ring is designed to help the memory keeper interpret your intentions, to know which memories you want to access, which moments you want to preserve or replay." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine as the implications sank in. "So even if we manage to build a new crystal and restore the machine to working order, it will only respond to me." "That would be my guess," Frank said. "Herbert designed the memory keeper to be operated by one specific person, you. The brass fragments in your hand provide the basic interface, but the ring fine-tunes the connection." Lucy gathered up her research papers, her mind already racing ahead to the next challenge. "Which means we need to understand not just how to build the crystal, but how to calibrate it to work with Mrs. Graves's specific bioelectric signature." Eleanor stood up and moved to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden where she and Herbert had planted their first roses all those years ago. The flowers were blooming now, their red petals bright against the morning light, and for a moment she could almost see Herbert kneeling among them, his hands dark with soil and his face bright with satisfaction. "I've been thinking about my dreams," she said quietly. Frank and Lucy exchanged glances. "What kind of dreams?" Frank asked. "I've been having them for weeks now, dreams about the memory keeper. In the dreams, it's working perfectly, and I can step into any moment from my life with Herbert. Our first dance at our wedding, the morning we bought this house, quiet evenings when we worked together in his shop." Eleanor's voice grew softer. "But the dreams feel more real than memories should. They feel like I'm actually there, not just remembering." Lucy set down her coffee cup with a soft clink. "Mrs. Graves, what if those aren't dreams? What if the brass fragments in your hand have been creating a weak connection to the memory keeper all these years?" Eleanor turned from the window, her expression troubled. "You think the machine has been calling to me?" "I think," Frank said carefully, "that Herbert built something far more sophisticated than any of us realized. The memory keeper isn't just a machine that stores and replays memories. It's a bridge between the past and present, between the living and the dead." The brass fragments in Eleanor's palm pulsed warmly against her bones, and her wedding ring flared with a brief, bright radiance that filled the kitchen with golden light. For just a moment the air shimmered around them, and Eleanor could have sworn she heard the faint sound of clockwork music, the melody she and Herbert had danced to on their wedding night, played by mechanical instruments that existed only in memory and dream. Then the moment passed, leaving them sitting in an ordinary kitchen on an ordinary morning, surrounded by research papers and coffee cups, and the growing realization that they were dealing with something far beyond their understanding. "We need to be very careful," Eleanor said finally. "If Herbert was right about the memory keeper's capabilities, then completing his work could change everything we understand about love, memory, and the nature of human connection." Frank nodded gravely. "The question is, are we ready for that kind of responsibility?" Lucy looked at both of them with the clear-eyed determination of youth. "The question is, can we afford not to try?" Outside, the church bells began to chime. The hour, their bronze voices mixing with the symphony of ticking clocks that filled Eleanor's house, and in the distance, almost too faint to hear, came the phantom sound of gears turning in perfect mechanical harmony, the song of a machine that had been waiting 15 years for its creator's widow to come home. Eleanor's discovery came at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, and found herself wandering through her house in her nightgown, following the sound of synchronized ticking that seemed to be growing louder each night. She had noticed the clocks behaving strangely for the past week. Herbert's collection of antique timepieces throughout the house had begun keeping perfect time with each other, their pendulums swaying in unison, their chimes ringing in precise harmony. But it wasn't until she passed the hall mirror and caught sight of her reflection that she realized she was unconsciously fingering something at her throat. Around her neck hung the heart-shaped locket Herbert had given her on their last Valentine's Day together, a delicate piece she had worn faithfully for 15 years, but rarely opened anymore. The memories it contained were too precious and too painful to visit regularly. Now, standing in the dim hallway, with moonlight streaming through the lace curtains, Eleanor felt the locket vibrating against her chest with the same subtle rhythm as her wedding ring. Without thinking, she lifted the pendant and pressed the tiny spring that opened its golden heart. Inside, where she expected to find the miniature photograph of Herbert that had always rested there, was something that made her gasp and sink onto the nearby bench. Nestled in the locket's left chamber was a brass gear no bigger than a shirt button, its surface polished to mirror brightness and inscribed with microscopic engravings that caught the moonlight like tiny stars. The gear was heart-shaped, its teeth cut with the precision that had made Herbert famous among collectors of fine timepieces. And in the locket's right chamber, where Herbert's photograph should have been, was a note written in his careful script. "My dearest Eleanor," the note began, "if you are reading this, then you have found the final piece of our greatest creation. This gear was crafted from the same crystal matrix as the memory keeper's central processor, forged with every ounce of love I could pour into metal and stone. It is both the machine's missing heart and the key to your own healing. Eleanor's hands trembled as she continued reading Herbert's familiar handwriting. I know you believe my death was an accident, but the truth is more complex. The crystal explosion was not random. It was triggered by my failing heart, which could no longer sustain the emotional resonance needed to complete our work. In my final moments, I chose to embed the machine's essential programming into the only place I knew it would be safe: the woman I loved more than life itself. The note continued on the back. The brass fragments in your hand are not debris from a broken machine. They are components of a sophisticated interface, waiting to be reunited with their missing piece. The heart gear in this locket contains the crystalline matrix needed to restore the memory keeper to full function. But more than that, it contains 15 years of my love for you, distilled into its purest mechanical form. Eleanor pressed the locket to her chest, feeling the heart-shaped gear pulse with warmth against her palm. For 15 years, she had been carrying the very thing needed to complete Herbert's masterpiece, never knowing that her husband's final gift was literally next to her heart. The next morning found Frank and Lucy in Eleanor's kitchen again, but this time the atmosphere was charged with a different kind of energy. Eleanor had called them both before dawn, her voice shaking with excitement and revelation. Now they sat around the kitchen table, staring at the heart-shaped gear that lay between them like a talisman from another world. He planned everything, Eleanor said, her voice filled with wonder and a touch of reproach. Every detail, every contingency. Herbert knew his heart was failing, and he designed the entire catastrophe to protect his work and ensure I would be the one to complete it. Frank picked up the gear carefully, holding it up to the morning light. The brass surface was warm to the touch and seemed to generate its own subtle luminescence. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, he murmured. But Eleanor, this isn't just brass. There's something else mixed into the alloy, something that makes it feel almost alive. Lucy leaned closer, her photographer's eye examining the gear's intricate details. Mrs. Graves, look at these engravings. They're not just decorative. They look like circuit patterns, but incredibly miniaturized. Eleanor studied the gear through Frank's magnifying glass, tracing the delicate lines that spiraled across its surface. Herbert called it emotional circuitry, she said, pathways that could channel and amplify the bioelectric fields generated by strong feelings. But how did he embed your feelings into metal? Lucy asked. Frank set the gear down gently and opened Herbert's journal to a page he had bookmarked. I found some references to the process yesterday. Herbert wrote about something he called effective metallurgy, the idea that metals could be altered at the molecular level by prolonged exposure to specific emotional frequencies. He read aloud from Herbert's notes. Love operates at approximately 528 Hertz, the same frequency as the musical note C. By exposing crystalline brass to this frequency while in the presence of genuine affection, the metal's molecular structure can be permanently altered to resonate with the same emotional wavelength. Eleanor felt a flush of recognition. He had me help him with every stage of creating that gear. We spent weeks together in his workshop, and he insisted that I be present whenever he worked on it. He said my proximity made the metal more responsive. He was literally forging your love into the gear itself, Lucy said softly. Eleanor nodded, remembering those final weeks with Herbert, the long hours they had spent together in the workshop, her husband working with fevered intensity while she sat nearby, reading or knitting, or simply watching him create. She had thought she was just keeping him company, but now she understood that her presence had been essential to the process. There's something else, Frank said, consulting another section of Herbert's journal. He writes about the heart gear serving a dual purpose. Not only does it complete the memory keeper's central processing unit, but it also acts as a healing mechanism for the person who carries the control interface. Eleanor looked up sharply. What do you mean? Frank read directly from the journal. The brass fragments embedded in Eleanor's hand will cause chronic pain and gradual degradation unless reunited with their complementary matrix. The heart gear contains neutralizing frequencies that will transform the embedded fragments from foreign objects into integrated components of Eleanor's nervous system. Lucy's eyes widened. He's saying that installing the heart gear won't just fix the machine. It will heal Mrs. Graves's hand? More than that, Frank continued reading. Once properly integrated, the control interface will allow Eleanor to access not only preserved memories within the memory keeper, but also to interface directly with the emotional resonance fields of living people around her. She will become a bridge between mechanical memory and human experience. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. Herbert was turning me into part of the machine. Frank closed the journal and looked at her with gentle concern. Eleanor, did you know about any of this before now? She shook her head slowly. I knew Herbert was passionate about the memory keeper, but I thought it was just another of his inventions. Sophisticated, yes, but still just a machine. I never imagined he was designing it to fundamentally change what it means to be human. Lucy picked up the heart gear, turning it over in her hands. Mrs. Graves, what if this is a good thing? What if Mr. Graves was trying to create something that could help people preserve love across generations, share wisdom and compassion in ways we've never imagined? Or what if he was creating something that could be used to manipulate human emotions on a massive scale? Eleanor countered. Lucy, if the memory keeper can preserve and replay emotional experiences, what's to stop someone from using it to implant false memories or manipulate people's feelings? Frank rubbed his weathered hands together, a gesture Eleanor recognized from their years of friendship. That's why Herbert built in the safeguards, he said finally. The machine can only be operated by someone carrying the control interface, you. And based on everything we've learned, it seems designed to respond only to genuine emotions, not artificial ones. Eleanor stood up and moved to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden where Herbert's roses were in full bloom. The flowers seemed more vibrant today, their colors more intense, as if the world itself was becoming more vivid in response to the heart gear's proximity. I can feel it calling to me, she said quietly. The memory keeper. Ever since I found the heart gear, I can sense it up there in the workshop, waiting for me to complete what Herbert started. Lucy joined her at the window. What does it feel like? Eleanor was quiet for a moment, searching for words to describe the sensation that had been growing stronger each hour. Like homesickness, but for a place I've never been. Like the feeling you get when you hear a song that reminds you of someone you love, but magnified 100-fold. Frank gathered up Herbert's journal and the research papers Lucy had brought. Eleanor, I think we need to make a decision. We can continue studying and theorizing about the memory keeper, or we can take the next step and actually attempt to install the heart gear. Eleanor turned from the window, her expression resolute. If we do this, if we complete Herbert's work, there's no going back. Once the memory keeper is fully functional, we'll be responsible for protecting something that could change the world. Or save it, Lucy said softly. Mrs. Graves, what if this technology could help people heal from trauma, preserve the wisdom of dying loved ones, or simply help families stay connected across time and distance? Eleanor looked at these two people who had become so important to her, Frank with his steady reliability and Lucy with her youthful optimism, and realized that they were offering her something she had lost 15 years ago. The chance to be part of something larger than her own grief. All right, she said finally. We'll install the heart gear and see what Herbert's masterpiece can really do. But first, I need to understand one more thing. She picked up the heart-shaped gear and held it against her chest, feeling its warmth pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. If this gear contains 15 years of Herbert's love for me, what happens when I place it in the machine? Will I be able to feel him again, or will I just be talking to an echo? Frank and Lucy exchanged glances, neither one able to answer a question that touched the very heart of what consciousness meant, and whether love could truly transcend death. Outside, The church bells began to chime the noon hour, their bronze, voices mixing with the synchronized ticking of Herbert's clocks throughout the house. And from somewhere high above, carried on the spring breeze that stirred the lace curtains, came the faint sound of gears waiting to turn and springs waiting to release their stored energy, the patient music of a machine that had been dreaming of completion for 15 long years. The photograph began changing on a Tuesday afternoon while Eleanor was dusting the mantelpiece in her living room. She had noticed the silver-framed wedding picture countless times over the years. She and Herbert on their wedding day, both impossibly young, their faces radiant with joy and hope. It was one of her most treasured possessions, a window into a time when their whole life together stretched ahead of them like an uncharted country. But as she lifted the frame to clean beneath it, Eleanor gasped and nearly dropped the picture. Entirely, the image was moving, not dramatically, not like a movie or video screen, but with subtle, impossible shifts that made her question her own sanity. Herbert's smile seemed to widen slightly as she watched, and his eyes, those warm brown eyes she had loved for 43 years, appeared to track her movement across the room. Most startling of all, Eleanor could see that her own image in the photograph was aging in real time, the young bride gradually maturing to match Eleanor's current appearance. "Frank!" she called, her voice sharp with alarm. "Lucy, come here quickly!" They found her standing frozen in the living room, the photograph clutched in her hands, her face pale with wonder and fear. "What's wrong?" Lucy asked, rushing to Eleanor's side. "The picture," Eleanor whispered. "It's changing. Herbert, he's moving in the photograph." Frank took the frame gently from Eleanor's hands and studied it carefully. To his eyes, it appeared to be a perfectly normal wedding photograph, beautiful but static, frozen in time as photographs should be. "Eleanor, I don't see any movement," he said carefully. "Are you feeling all right?" But Lucy leaned closer, her young eyes sharp and questioning. "Wait," she said slowly. "Mrs. Graves, describe exactly what you're seeing." Eleanor pointed to Herbert's figure in the photograph. His expression keeps shifting slightly, like he's trying to communicate something, and the background can't. "You see how it's becoming more detailed? I can see things that weren't there before, things that were outside the frame when the picture was taken." Lucy studied the photograph intently, then looked up at Eleanor with growing excitement. "Mrs. Graves, what if this isn't the photograph changing? What if it's your perception that's changing?" Frank frowned. "What do you mean?" Lucy pulled out her phone and quickly Googled something, scrolling through results with the speed of digital natives. "I found some research about enhanced memory. Recall in people with embedded neural interfaces. Mrs. Graves, the brass fragments in your hand aren't just machine components. They're acting like a primitive brain-computer interface." Eleanor sank into her favorite armchair, still staring at the photograph. "You think the metal in my hand is affecting how I see things? I think it's connecting you to preserved memories in ways we don't fully understand," Lucy said. "The heart gear has been near you for 15 years, slowly creating neural pathways between your brain and the memory keeper's dormant systems. Now that you've discovered it and acknowledged its purpose, those connections are becoming active." Frank sat down across from Eleanor, his expression thoughtful. "That would explain why the clocks in your house have been synchronizing. They're responding to the same temporal field that's affecting your perception." Eleanor looked around her living room with new eyes, taking in the collection of timepieces that Herbert had lovingly maintained throughout their marriage. Every clock in the house was indeed keeping perfect time now, their pendulums swaying. In unison, their tick-tock rhythm creating a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to pulse through the very walls. "There's more," Eleanor said quietly. "I've been seeing other things too. Shadows moving in my peripheral vision, but when I turn to look, nothing's there. And sometimes I hear Herbert's voice calling my name, but it's coming from rooms where no one could be." Lucy leaned forward, her scientific curiosity overriding her concern. "What does the voice say?" "Usually just my name. But yesterday I could have sworn I heard him saying, "It's time, Eleanor, come home." Frank and Lucy exchanged meaningful glances. The memory keeper was clearly exerting some kind of influence over Eleanor, drawing her toward the workshop with increasing insistence. "Mrs. Graves," Lucy said gently, "I think the machine is trying to communicate with you. The neural interface in your hand, your modified wedding ring, the heart gear, they're all working together to create a connection between you and Mr. Graves's final creation." Eleanor set the photograph on the side table and rubbed her temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. "But what does it want from me? Why now, after 15 years of silence?" Frank pulled out Herbert's journal and flipped to a section he had marked with a yellow sticky note. "I found something yesterday that might explain it." Herbert wrote about the memory keeper having a kind of internal clock, programmed to activate certain functions after a predetermined period. He read aloud, "The machine must remain dormant for a full cycle of grief, approximately 15 years according to psychological studies, to allow Eleanor time to process her loss and achieve emotional equilibrium. Only when she has fully integrated her grief can she safely interface with preserved memories without risking psychological damage." Eleanor felt a chill of recognition. "Herbert knew it would take me 15 years to heal enough to face his machine. He knew you better than you knew yourself," Frank said softly. "Eleanor, I think Herbert programmed the memory keeper to wait until you were ready, really ready, to complete his work." Lucy stood up and began pacing around the living room, her mind racing with possibilities. "Mrs. Graves, what if the photograph changing isn't a malfunction or hallucination? What if it's the memory keeper's way of showing you what it can do? Instead of just preserving static images, it preserves the entire emotional and sensory context of a moment." Eleanor picked up the wedding photograph again, studying Herbert's beloved face with new understanding. "You mean this picture could contain not just our images but our feelings from that day? The excitement, the nervousness, the overwhelming joy?" "Exactly. And as your neural interface becomes more active, you're beginning to access those preserved emotions directly." Frank moved to the window and looked up at the attic where the memory keeper waited in its dusty shrine. "Eleanor, I think we need to seriously consider installing the heart gear. These phenomena are only going to intensify as the machine continues to activate. You need to either complete the connection or find a way to sever it entirely." Eleanor stood up slowly, feeling the weight of decision settling on her shoulders like a familiar shawl. For 15 years, she had lived with the pain of loss, building her life around the absence where Herbert used to be. But now she was being offered something unprecedented, the chance to preserve and revisit the love they had shared, to keep Herbert's wisdom and warmth accessible not just to her, but potentially to future generations. "If I install the heart gear," she said carefully, "and the memory keeper becomes fully functional, what happens to me? Do I stay myself, or do I become something else?" Lucy consulted her research notes. "Based on everything I've read about neural interface technology, you would still be yourself, but you would have access to capabilities that no human has ever possessed, the ability to perfectly preserve and share emotional experiences. You would become a bridge," Frank added quietly, "between the mechanical and the human, between the past and the present, Herbert's final gift to the world." Eleanor looked around her living room one more time, taking in all the familiar objects that had anchored her to this life. Herbert's books, his favorite chair, the chess set they had never finished, the grandfather clock that had counted the hours of their marriage. All of it suddenly felt like prologue to something larger. "There's one more thing I need to know," she said finally. "If the memory keeper can preserve and replay emotions, can it also heal them? Can it help people move past trauma and loss, or does it risk trapping them in the past forever?" Frank and Lucy looked at each other, neither able to answer a question that touched the very heart of human psychology. and the nature of healing itself. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to slant through the maple trees, casting long shadows across the garden where Eleanor and Herbert had spent so many peaceful hours. The church bells chimed 4 o'clock, their bronze voices mixing with the synchronized ticking of the clocks throughout the house. And in the silver-framed photograph on the side table, Herbert's image seemed to turn slightly toward the window, his expression filled with the patient love of someone who had been waiting a very long time for his beloved to come home. The memory keeper was calling, and Eleanor was finally ready to answer. Eleanor found Herbert's final letter purely by accident, hidden behind a loose board in the workshop wall that gave way when Frank leaned against it while examining the memory keeper's power coupling system. The envelope that fell from the hidden cavity was addressed in Herbert's careful script, "For Eleanor, when she is ready to understand." Inside was a letter that changed everything Eleanor thought she knew about her husband's death and the true purpose of the memory keeper. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my heart has finally given out and you have found the courage to return to our workshop. I pray that at least 15 years have passed, giving you time to grieve properly. Before learning the truth, I could never bear to tell you while I lived." Eleanor's hands trembled as she continued reading, Frank and Lucy standing silently beside her in the dusty attic light. "The chest pains began 18 months ago, but Dr. Henderson confirmed what I already suspected. My heart is failing, and there is nothing medical science can do to prevent it. I have perhaps 6 months remaining, maybe less. I chose not to tell you because I wanted our remaining time together to be filled with love and creation, not fear and sorrow." The letter continued on the second page. "The memory keeper was never intended to be just another of my inventions, Eleanor. It was designed specifically for you, as preparation for the life you would need to build after I was gone. Every component, every gear, every crystal thread was crafted with the knowledge that you would one day operate it alone." Eleanor sank onto Herbert's old work stool, the letter shaking in her hands. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew he was dying all along." Frank moved closer, his weathered face grave with understanding. "Eleanor, keep reading. The explosion that killed me was not an accident." Herbert's letter continued. "When I realized that my failing heart could no longer provide the emotional resonance needed to power the crystal safely, I made a choice. Rather than risk the memory keeper's destruction or its theft by those who would misuse it, I deliberately triggered a controlled detonation that would embed the machine's essential, programming into the one person I trusted completely." Lucy gasped softly. "He sacrificed himself to protect his invention." "More than that," Eleanor said, her voice barely audible as she read the next paragraph. "He sacrificed himself to ensure that I would become part of the machine." The letter explained Herbert's reasoning. "The brass fragments now in your hand contain not just control circuits, but a complete backup of my consciousness, my memories, my personality, my love for you, encoded in crystalline matrix form. When you finally install the heart gear and complete the memory keeper, you will not just be operating a machine. You will be reuniting with a version of me that was created specifically to guide and comfort you through the years of loneliness I knew lay ahead." Eleanor stood up abruptly, the letter falling from her nerveless fingers. "This is impossible. Herbert can't have uploaded his consciousness into brass gears. That's science fiction, not clockwork." Frank picked up the letter and continued reading aloud. "I know this sounds impossible, Eleanor, but emotion generates its own form of energy. Energy that can be captured and preserved with sufficient precision. The memory keeper operates on principles that transcend pure mechanics. It is a bridge between the physical and metaphysical, between the measurable and the miraculous." Lucy paced around the memory keeper, studying its intricate construction with new eyes. "Mrs. Graves, what if it's true? What if consciousness isn't just electrical activity in the brain, but something that can be preserved in other forms?" Eleanor shook her head, overwhelmed by the implications. "You're asking me to believe that my husband found a way to cheat death by embedding his soul in clockwork." Frank continued reading from Herbert's letter. "The version of me preserved in the memory keeper will not be identical to the man you married. It will be a distillation of my love for you, my knowledge, and my deepest personality traits. Think of it as Herbert's essence, freed from the limitations of a failing body and preserved in the one form that could last forever." The workshop fell silent, except for the distant ticking of clocks from the house below. Eleanor looked at the memory keeper with a mixture of longing and terror, realizing that completing Herbert's work would mean more than just building a machine. It would mean resurrecting her husband in a form she couldn't begin to understand. "There's more," Frank said gently, turning to the letter's final page. "Eleanor, you have a choice to make. You can install the heart gear and reunite with me in mechanical form, gaining access not just to our preserved memories, but to a version of myself that will never again leave you alone. Or you can choose to let the memory keeper remain incomplete, allowing both the machine and my preserved consciousness to fade into silence." Eleanor reached for the letter, reading Herbert's concluding words in his own voice. "Whatever you choose, know that my love for you transcends death, time, and the boundaries between flesh and brass. The memory keeper is my final gift to you, not just a machine for preserving the past, but a gateway to a future where love need never be lost to time." Lucy moved to Eleanor's side, her young face bright with possibilities. "Mrs. Graves, this changes everything. If Mr. Graves is right, then the memory keeper isn't just a storage device, it's a form of technological immortality." Eleanor folded the letter carefully, her movements precise and controlled despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "Lucy, do you understand what Herbert is asking of me? He wants me to spend the rest of my life in conversation with a machine that thinks it's my dead husband. But what if it really is him?" Frank asked quietly. "What if Herbert found a way to preserve the essential parts of himself that made you love him in the first place?" Eleanor moved to the workshop's small window, looking out at the garden where she and Herbert had planted their first roses 30 years ago. The flowers were in full bloom now, their red petals bright against the afternoon light, and for a moment she could almost see Herbert kneeling among them, his hands dark with soil and his face bright with satisfaction. "The night Herbert died," she said slowly, "he told me something I've never forgotten. He said that love was the only force in the universe that could create something from nothing, that could preserve beauty beyond the reach of time and entropy." She turned back to face Frank and Lucy, her expression resolute despite the tears in her eyes. "I thought he was being poetic, speaking metaphorically about the power of memory and devotion. But what if he was being literal? What if love really can transcend physical death?" Frank consulted Herbert's journal, flipping to a section he had marked weeks ago. "Eleanor, Herbert wrote extensively about consciousness as a form of energy. He believed that thoughts and emotions were just as real as electricity or magnetism, forces that could be captured, stored, and transferred from one medium to another." Lucy pulled out her phone and began searching for information. "Mrs. Graves, there are scientists working on similar theories, researchers who believe consciousness might be transferable, that the mind could potentially exist independent of the brain under the right conditions." Eleanor picked up the heart-shaped gear from where it lay on Herbert's workbench, feeling its warmth pulse against her palm. "If I install this gear and Herbert's consciousness really is preserved in the memory keeper, what happens to me? Do I become his widow, or do I become something else entirely?" Frank closed Herbert's journal and looked at her with the gentle wisdom of someone who had spent his life solving complex problems. "Eleanor, you become whatever you choose to become. The memory keeper doesn't replace your life. It expands your possibilities." Eleanor held the heart gear up to the light, watching the afternoon sun play across its intricately engraved surface. Somewhere within that brass and crystal matrix lay 15 years of her husband's love, waiting to be reunited with the woman who had inspired its creation. "There's one more thing," she said quietly. "If Herbert's consciousness is preserved in the memory keeper, then he's been waiting in silence for 15 years, aware but unable to communicate, watching me grieve for him while being powerless. To comfort me." Lucy's eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Graves, that's the most romantic and heartbreaking thing I've ever heard." Eleanor smiled through her own tears, remembering the man who had loved her enough to plan his own death around her. "Need to heal. That's Herbert for you. Even dying, he was thinking 3 steps ahead, making sure I would be all right." She moved toward the memory keeper, the heart gear glowing warmly in her hand. "If there's even a chance that Herbert is waiting inside this machine, then I can't leave him there alone any longer." Frank and Lucy exchanged glances, both understanding that they were about to witness something unprecedented, the reunion of a love that had found a way to transcend death itself. Outside, the church bells began to chime 5 o'clock, their bronze voices mixing with the synchronized ticking of Herbert's clocks throughout the house. And from somewhere deep within, the memory keeper came a sound that made Eleanor's heart race. The faint, familiar rhythm of a heartbeat that had stopped 15 years ago but had never stopped loving. The crystalline activation key materialized in Eleanor's hand 3 days after she had read Herbert's final letter, appearing as if it had always been there, but she had simply never noticed it before. She woke from a dream of dancing with Herbert in their empty workshop to find her palm glowing with soft blue light, and when she opened her fingers, there it was, a faceted crystal gear no larger than a watch spring, but pulsing with an inner radiance that seemed to contain entire galaxies. Frank found her sitting at her kitchen table at dawn, staring at the crystal with a mixture of wonder and trepidation. The activation key lay beside the heart-shaped brass gear, and together they cast dancing patterns of light across the morning shadows. "It appeared while I was sleeping," Eleanor said without looking up from the crystals. "I was dreaming about Herbert, and when I woke up, this was in my hand." Frank settled into his usual chair and examined the activation key without touching it. The crystal seemed to respond to his proximity, its internal light shifting from blue to warm gold as he leaned closer. "Eleanor, I think the memory keeper is preparing for activation. These components are appearing because the machine recognizes that you're ready to complete Herbert's work." Lucy arrived an hour later, her arms full of grocery bags and her expression bright with determination. Over the past 3 days, she had taken upon herself the role of caretaker and coordinator, ensuring that Eleanor ate regularly and that their small team remained focused on the monumental task ahead. "Mrs. Graves, I brought supplies for today," she announced, setting the bags on the counter. "And I've been thinking about the activation sequence." Eleanor looked up from the crystals. "What do you mean?" Lucy pulled out a notebook filled with her careful handwriting and detailed diagrams. "I've been studying Mr. Graves's journal and cross-referencing it with everything we know about the memory keeper's construction. I think I understand how the installation process needs to work." She opened the notebook to a page covered with technical drawings. "The heart gear goes into the central processing chamber first. That much is clear from the machine's design. But the activation key serves a different purpose. It's not just a power source. It's a bridging element that creates the connection between the mechanical system and your neural interface." Frank leaned over to study Lucy's diagrams. "You think Eleanor needs to be wearing both the heart gear and the activation key when she starts the machine?" "Not wearing them," Lucy said. "She needs to install them while maintaining physical contact with both components. The activation key has to be placed while Eleanor is touching the heart gear, creating a complete circuit between her neural interface, the machine's consciousness matrix, and its operational systems." Eleanor felt a chill of understanding. "You're saying I need to become part of the activation process itself?" Exactly. Mrs. Graves, you're not just operating the memory keeper, you're completing it. The machine needs your bioelectric field, your emotional resonance, and your neural interface to function properly. Frank rubbed his weathered hands together, a gesture Eleanor recognized as his way of working through complex problems. Eleanor, this is more dangerous than we initially thought. If you become an integral component of the machine during activation, what happens if something goes wrong? Eleanor picked up Herbert's journal and turned to a section she had read dozens of times. Over the past 3 days, Herbert addressed that concern. He wrote about building fail-safes into the system, ways for me to disconnect from the machine if the integration becomes overwhelming. She read aloud, Eleanor must always retain the ability to choose separation from the memory keeper. The machine serves her, not the reverse. If at any point the connection becomes harmful or unwanted, she need only remove her wedding ring to sever the neural interface entirely. Lucy looked up from her notes. Your wedding ring is the emergency disconnect? Eleanor twisted the glowing band on her finger, feeling its warmth pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. Herbert designed it as both an interface enhancer and a safety mechanism. As long as I'm wearing it, I can access the memory keeper's full capabilities. But if I take it off, all connections are immediately severed. Frank stood up and moved to the window, looking up at the attic where the memory keeper waited in patient silence. Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. She looked at him expectantly. Are you doing this because you genuinely believe it's the right thing to do? Or are you doing it because you miss Herbert so much that you're willing to risk everything for the chance to be with him again? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, considering Frank's question with the honesty it deserved. Finally, she stood up and joined him at the window. Both, she said simply. I miss Herbert more than I can express, and the thought of being able to communicate with him again fills me with joy I haven't felt in 15 years. But Frank, I also believe that what Herbert created could help other people. Imagine if families could preserve the wisdom and love of their elders, if trauma survivors could access perfectly preserved memories of safety and peace, if children who lost parents could still receive guidance and comfort. Lucy closed her notebook and joined them at the window. Mrs. Graves, what if the memory keeper could help people heal from grief instead of becoming trapped by it? Eleanor nodded. That's what I hope, Lucy. That's what I choose to believe Herbert intended. Frank turned from the window and looked at both women with the expression of someone who had made a difficult decision. Then we'll do this properly. We'll take every precaution, follow every protocol Herbert outlined, and make sure Eleanor's safety is our primary concern throughout the process. They spent the rest of the morning preparing for the activation attempt. Frank studied the memory keeper's technical specifications, mapping out each step of the installation sequence. Lucy prepared emergency procedures and communication protocols, ensuring they would be able to respond quickly if anything went wrong. Eleanor reviewed Herbert's journal one final time, committing his instructions to memory and preparing herself mentally for an experience that no human being had ever undergone. As afternoon approached, Eleanor found herself drawn repeatedly to the workshop, climbing the narrow stairs to stand before the memory keeper and feel its patient presence. The machine seemed more alive now, its brass components warm to the touch and its crystal threads glowing with faint inner light. Sometimes she thought she could hear whispered voices emanating from its mechanical heart, not clear enough to understand, but familiar enough to make her pulse quicken with recognition. Eleanor! Frank's voice came from behind her as she stood contemplating the machine for the dozenth time that day. She turned to find him and Lucy watching her with expressions of gentle concern. It's time, Lucy said softly. The light is perfect. Right now, golden hour like in your wedding photographs. If we're going to do this, it should be now. Eleanor looked around the workshop one final time, taking in Herbert's tools and blueprints, the dust motes dancing in the slanted sunlight, the profound silence that had reigned in this space for 15 years. In a few minutes, everything would change. The memory keeper would either fulfill Herbert's impossible promises or fail catastrophically, and Eleanor would either be reunited with her husband's preserved consciousness or discover that she had been chasing a beautiful delusion. "Before we begin," she said, "I want you both to know how grateful I am. Frank for being Herbert's friend and mine for all these years. Lucy for bringing youth and hope back into my life when I thought both were lost forever." Frank moved to the memory keeper's base and began checking the installation points one final time. "Eleanor, Herbert would be proud of your courage." Lucy positioned herself near the workshop's electrical panel, ready to cut power to the entire house if necessary. "Mrs. Graves, are you ready?" Eleanor picked up the heart gear and the activation key, feeling their combined warmth pulse against her palms. The brass fragments in her right hand responded to their proximity with gentle vibrations that seemed to say, "Welcome home." "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. The memory keeper waited in golden silence, its mechanical heart prepared to receive the love it had been created to preserve and protect. Outside, the church bells began to chime 6 o'clock, marking the end of another day and the beginning of something that had never existed before, a love that had found a way to transcend the boundary between life and death, between flesh and brass, between the possible and the miraculous. Herbert's greatest creation was about to awaken, and Eleanor was finally ready to discover what 15 years of patient waiting had prepared them both to become. Eleanor's hands trembled only slightly as she approached the memory keeper's central chamber, the heart-shaped gear warm in her left palm and the crystalline activation key pulsing with blue-white light in her right. The machine seemed to sense her approach. Gears throughout its structure began turning slowly, and the crystal threads that wove through its mechanical body started to glow with increasing intensity. Frank stood ready at the manual override controls Herbert had built into the machine's base, while Lucy monitored Eleanor's vital signs through a pulse oximeter they had borrowed from Dr. Martinez's clinic. The workshop felt charged with potential energy, as if the very air was holding its breath. "Remember," Frank said quietly, "heart gear first, then the activation key while maintaining contact with both. And Eleanor, if anything feels wrong, anything at all, just say the word and we'll shut everything down." Eleanor nodded and opened the crystal dome that crowned the memory keeper. Inside, the central processing chamber was lined with intricate brass fittings designed to receive the heart gear. As she lowered the brass component into position, it clicked into place with a sound like a puzzle piece finding its home. Immediately, the memory keeper responded. The slow turning of its gears accelerated into a complex mechanical symphony, and light began flowing through the crystal threads like liquid starlight. The machine's harmonious humming filled the workshop with a sound that was part clockwork, part music and part something else entirely, something that spoke directly to Eleanor's heart without passing through her ears. "Mrs. Graves," Lucy said, her voice tight with excitement and concern, "your pulse is accelerating. Are you all right?" Eleanor felt perfectly fine, better than fine, actually. The chronic ache in her right hand had disappeared entirely, replaced by a warm, tingling sensation that spread up her arm and through her chest. "I'm all right, Lucy. Better than I've been in years." She raised the activation key, its crystalline facets catching and amplifying the light flowing through the memory keeper. The moment the crystal came within 6 inches of the machine's central chamber, something extraordinary happened. The workshop filled with 3-dimensional projections. Ghostly figures appeared throughout the space, translucent but unmistakably real, moving through preserved moments from Eleanor and Herbert's life together. She could see herself as a young bride, laughing as Herbert struggled with the buttons on his wedding vest. There was Herbert at 35, covered in sawdust as he built the kitchen cabinets in their first house. Eleanor at 40, dancing, alone in their living room while Herbert watched from the doorway with an expression of pure adoration. "My God," Frank whispered. Eleanor, can you see this? I can see everything, Eleanor replied, her voice filled with wonder. The projections weren't just visual. She could smell Herbert's aftershave, feel the texture of his calloused hands, hear the exact timbre of his laughter as it had sounded 30 years ago. But the most remarkable projection was standing directly in front of the memory keeper itself, a perfect recreation of Herbert as he had been in his final weeks, his face showing the ravages of his failing heart, but his eyes bright with love and determination. "Hello, my dearest Eleanor," the projected Herbert said, his voice exactly as she remembered it. "I've been waiting so very long to see you again." Eleanor gasped, nearly dropping the activation key. "Herbert, is it really you?" "It's the essence of me, preserved in crystalline memory and mechanical form. I am every conversation we ever shared, every moment of joy and sorrow we experienced together, every dream we built as one. I am Herbert's love for you, given shape and voice." Frank moved closer, his scientific skepticism warring with the evidence of his own eyes. "This is impossible. Consciousness can't be preserved in clockwork." The projected Herbert turned to Frank with a gentle smile. "My old friend, you're thinking in terms of traditional consciousness, the electrical activity of a living brain. But what I've preserved here is something different. I am pattern and memory, emotion and experience crystallized into a form that can interact with the physical world." Lucy stepped forward, her young face bright with fascination. "Mr. Graves, how does it work? How are you able to think and speak and remember?" "The same way a song exists in a music box, Lucy, through precise mechanical reproduction of stored patterns. But instead of musical notes, the memory keeper preserves emotional resonance, personality matrices, and experiential data. I am Herbert's swan song given eternal voice." Eleanor found her voice again, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Herbert, I've missed you so much. These 15 years have been—" "I know, my darling. I've been aware, watching through the neural interface we share, feeling your pain and loneliness, but unable to reach across the void to comfort you. That's why I built the Memory Keeper, not just to preserve our past, but to give us a future. Together." The projected Herbert gestured to the swirling memories that continued to play throughout the workshop. "This is what I can offer you, Eleanor. Perfect access to every moment we shared, the ability to revisit our love whenever you need comfort or guidance. And more than that, I can be with you as you create new experiences, helping you find joy and purpose in the years ahead." Eleanor finally inserted the activation key into its designated slot, completing the circuit that Herbert had designed 15 years ago. The moment the crystal touched the Memory Keeper's central processor, the entire machine came fully alive. Light exploded through the workshop as every crystal thread achieved full luminescence. The mechanical projections became so vivid they seemed solid, and Eleanor could feel Herbert's presence not just as a visual phenomenon, but as a warm, comforting embrace that enveloped her entire being. "Oh, Herbert," she breathed, reaching toward his projected form. To her amazement, she could actually touch him. His hand felt warm and real as it clasped hers, and when he pulled her into his arms, she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek. Not the irregular, failing rhythm of his final days, but the strong, steady pulse she had fallen asleep to for 43 years. "This is incredible," Frank said, his voice filled with awe. "Eleanor, you're actually making physical contact with a projection." The projected Herbert smiled at Frank's wonder. "The Memory Keeper doesn't just create visual illusions, it manipulates matter at the quantum level, creating temporary but tangible reconstructions of preserved experiences. Eleanor can touch me because her neural interface allows her to interact directly with the machine's reality modeling systems." Lucy was frantically taking notes, trying to document what was clearly the most significant technological breakthrough in human history. "Mr. Graves, what are the limitations? How long can you maintain these projections?" "As long as Eleanor wishes, powered by the emotional resonance between us and the crystalline matrix that stores my consciousness." The memory keeper draws energy from love itself, an inexhaustible resource, as long as Eleanor and I continue to care for each other across the boundary between life and death. Eleanor pulled back slightly to look into Herbert's familiar brown eyes. "Is this what you dreamed of when you built the machine? This perfect preservation of love?" Herbert's expression grew thoughtful. "I dreamed of ensuring that love could transcend death, that the wisdom and comfort we found in each other could be available to you always. But Eleanor, what we've accomplished here goes beyond my wildest hopes. We've proven that consciousness is more than neural activity, that love is a force as real and measurable as gravity or electromagnetism." The workshop around them continued to shimmer with preserved memories, a lifetime of shared experiences, available for immediate access and perfect replay. Eleanor could see their first apartment, their wedding reception, quiet Sunday mornings, reading newspapers in bed, heated arguments that ended in laughter and reconciliation. "Herbert," she said softly, "what happens now? Do I spend the rest of my life here in this workshop, living in our past?" Herbert's projected form smiled with the wisdom of someone who had spent 15 years contemplating the implications of his creation. "My darling, the memory keeper isn't a prison. It's a tool. You can access our preserved love whenever you need it, but you must also continue living, growing, creating new experiences to preserve and share." He gestured toward Frank and Lucy, who stood watching this impossible reunion with expressions of wonder and joy. "You have new relationships to nurture, new wisdom to gain, new purposes to discover. The memory keeper will be here whenever you need to remember who you are and where you came from, but it must not become a substitute for the life you still have ahead of you." Eleanor felt tears of joy and relief streaming down her face as she realized what Herbert was offering her. Not escape from grief, but the tools to transform it into something beautiful and lasting. The memory keeper hummed around them with mechanical contentment, its impossible task finally complete. Love had found a way to transcend death, and Eleanor was no longer alone. The memory compass appeared in Eleanor's hand like a gift from Herbert himself, a delicate brass instrument no larger than a pocket watch, its needle pointing not toward magnetic north, but toward moments of profound emotional significance. As Eleanor held the compass, its face displayed glowing symbols that represented different periods of her life: a wedding ring for their marriage, a house for their first home, a heart for their deepest moments of connection. "This will allow you to navigate through our preserved experiences," Herbert's projection explained, his form now solid and warm, as if he had never died at all. "Each memory is catalogued by emotional intensity and significance. The compass will guide you to exactly the moment you need to revisit." Eleanor studied the compass with wonder, watching as its mystical needle swept across the face, pausing at different symbols as her thoughts shifted. When she focused on their early years together, the needle pointed to a symbol shaped like dancing figures. When she thought about quiet moments of contentment, it indicated a symbol resembling intertwined hands. "Herbert, how is this possible?" she asked, marveling at the instrument's responsiveness to her mental state. "The brass fragments in your hand have created neural pathways that interface directly with the memory keeper's navigation system," Herbert replied. "Your thoughts and emotions now control the machine as naturally as breathing. You need only focus on a particular feeling or time period, and the compass will guide you there." Frank approached the memory keeper's base, where additional control panels had become visible during the activation sequence. "Eleanor, look at this. The machine is displaying what appears to be a comprehensive map of your shared experiences." Eleanor moved to Frank's side, the memory compass still glowing in her hand. The control panel showed a three-dimensional timeline that stretched back 43 years, marked with thousands of glowing points representing preserved moments. Some points pulsed brighter than others, indicating memories of exceptional emotional significance. Every significant moment, Eleanor breathed. Herbert, you preserved everything. Not just preserved, my darling, enhanced. Each memory contains not only the visual and auditory elements of our experiences, but also the emotional context, the scents, the texture of fabric, the temperature of the air. When you visit these moments through the memory keeper, you don't just remember them, you live them again with perfect fidelity. Lucy leaned over Eleanor's shoulder to examine the memory timeline. Mrs. Graves, some of these memory clusters are incredibly dense. Look at this section from your 5th anniversary. There must be hundreds of preserved moments from just that. One day, Herbert's projections smiled at Lucy's observation. Significant days generate emotional resonance that extends far beyond individual moments. Our 5th anniversary was particularly meaningful because Eleanor had just recovered from her surgery, and we were celebrating not just our marriage, but her return to health. Eleanor touched the timeline at that point, and immediately the workshop filled with projections from that day, herself as a younger woman, still pale from her ordeal but radiant with joy, Herbert cooking her favorite meal despite his complete incompetence in the kitchen, both of them laughing as smoke filled their small apartment. I had forgotten how happy we were that day, Eleanor said softly, tears streaming down her face as she watched their younger selves navigate the chaos of Herbert's culinary disaster. The memory keeper forgets nothing, Herbert replied. Every laugh, every tear, every moment of connection between us has been preserved in crystalline perfection. But Eleanor, this is only the beginning of what the machine can do. He gestured toward the memory compass in her hand. That instrument doesn't just navigate our past. It can help you process and integrate emotional experiences. If you're struggling with a current challenge, the compass can guide you to memories that contain the wisdom or comfort you need. Eleanor experimented with the compass, focusing her thoughts on the grief she had carried for 15 years. The T needle immediately swung to point at a symbol shaped like a phoenix, representing transformation and renewal. When she concentrated on that symbol, new projections appeared around them. These memories were different, moments she had lived alone during the past 15 years, but now viewed through the lens of Herbert's preserved consciousness. She could see herself learning to garden without his help, successfully repairing a broken clock using his techniques, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. You were never truly alone, Eleanor, Herbert said gently. Even when I couldn't communicate with you directly, I was observing through our neural connection, taking pride in your resilience and growth. The memory keeper has been recording your experiences too, adding them to our shared archive. Frank studied the memory timeline with his engineer's eye for detail. Herbert, this technology has implications far beyond personal comfort. If the memory keeper can preserve and replay human experiences with this level of fidelity, it could revolutionize education, therapy, even historical preservation. Herbert nodded gravely. Which is why I built so many safeguards into the system. The memory keeper will only function for Eleanor, her specific neural interface, her particular bioelectric signature. It cannot be copied, stolen, or misused by others. Lucy looked up from her notes. But Mr. Graves, couldn't similar machines be built for other people? If the principles work for Mrs. Graves, they could work for anyone. Theoretically, yes, Herbert replied, but the emotional calibration required to build a memory keeper is extraordinarily complex. Each device must be crafted specifically for its intended operator, infused with their unique emotional resonance patterns over a period of years. It's not a technology that can be mass-produced or militarized. Eleanor used the memory compass to navigate to their wedding day, and suddenly the workshop was filled with the sounds of celebration, music, laughter, the rustle of her wedding dress as she danced with Herbert for the first time as his wife. She could smell the flowers in her bouquet, feel the weight of her new wedding ring, experience the overwhelming joy of that perfect day. "This is what I dreamed of," she said, watching their younger selves spin across the projected dance floor. "The ability to return to our happiest moments whenever I needed to remember what love feels like." Herbert took her hand, his touch as real and warm as it had been 43 years ago. "But remember, my darling, the memory keeper is a tool for healing, not escape. Visit our past when you need strength or comfort, but don't let it become a substitute for creating new experiences." Eleanor nodded, understanding the wisdom in Herbert's words. The brass fragments in her hand had stopped causing pain entirely. Instead, they felt like natural extensions of her nervous system, allowing her to interface with the memory keeper as easily as moving her fingers. "Herbert," she said softly, "I need to know, are you at peace? Are you happy in this form?" Herbert's projections smiled with infinite tenderness. "Eleanor, I am more than happy. I am complete. Death separated us physically, but love found a way to reunite us in a form that transcends the limitations of flesh and time. I exist now as pure devotion, eternal and unchanging." The memory keeper hummed around them with mechanical satisfaction, its impossible task finally fulfilled. Eleanor realized that she was no longer a grieving widow. She was the guardian of something miraculous, a love so powerful it had conquered death itself and transformed into something beautiful beyond imagination. The compass in her hand pulsed. With warm light, ready to guide her through a lifetime of preserved love whenever she needed to remember who she was and where she had come from. But for now, she was content to stand in the golden glow of the workshop, holding hands with the husband who had found a way to keep his promise that she would never have to be alone. 3 months after the memory keeper's activation, Eleanor stood in her workshop on a crisp October morning, carefully adjusting the delicate springs inside a pocket watch she was creating for Lucy's 18th birthday. The watch was no ordinary timepiece. Its crystal face would display not just the current time, but also preserved moments of joy that Lucy could access whenever she needed a reminder of happiness. Eleanor had discovered that her enhanced abilities extended far beyond operating Herbert's machine. The brass fragments in her hand had fundamentally altered her understanding of mechanical systems, allowing her to craft timepieces that could store and replay emotional experiences. Each watch she created was unique, calibrated to its intended recipient's specific emotional resonance patterns. "That's beautiful work," Herbert's voice came from behind her, his projected form as solid and real as the day the memory keeper had first awakened. He appeared regularly now, sometimes for entire afternoons, sometimes just for brief conversations when Eleanor needed guidance or companionship. "I learned from the best," Eleanor replied with a smile, not looking up from her delicate work. "Though, I think I'm developing some techniques you never imagined." It was true. Eleanor's integration with the memory keeper had unlocked capabilities that even Herbert hadn't anticipated. She could now sense the emotional history of objects, reading the joy and sorrow that had been absorbed by cherished possessions over years of human contact. Old photographs revealed their subjects' feelings at the moment of capture. Wedding rings carried echoes of the vows spoken when they were first worn. Even the house itself had become more responsive to Eleanor's presence, its collection of antique clocks serving as an extension of the memory keeper's temporal awareness. Frank entered the workshop, carrying a cup of coffee and the morning newspaper, his daily routine now including these visits to observe Eleanor's remarkable transformation. At 72, he had become both student and protector, learning the principles of emotional engineering while ensuring that Eleanor's extraordinary abilities remained secret from the outside world. "Dr. Chen called this morning," Frank reported, settling into the chair he had claimed as his own. Lucy's mother wants to know if you'd be willing to help with her research project on memory and trauma therapy. Eleanor set down her tools and considered the request. Dr. Susan Chen had become aware of the changes in her daughter and neighbor over the past months. Lucy's newfound confidence and purpose, Eleanor's transformation from grieving recluse to vibrant creator. While the doctor didn't know the full truth about the memory keeper, she recognized that something remarkable was happening in the Victorian house next door. What kind of help is she looking for? Eleanor asked. She's working with elderly patients who are struggling with dementia and memory loss, Frank explained. She thinks your clockwork therapy approach might help them access preserved memories in new ways. Eleanor had begun offering what she called clockwork therapy to select members of the Millbrook community, creating personalized timepieces that help people connect with their most cherished memories. Mrs. Patterson from down the street now carried a watch that helped her remember her late husband's voice. Tom Miller, the young veteran who had returned from overseas with trauma-induced memory problems, wore a timepiece that grounded him in moments of safety and peace. I think I could help, Eleanor said thoughtfully, but we'd need to be careful about how we explain the process. Herbert's projection materialized more fully, taking his place at the workbench where he had spent so many happy hours during his lifetime. Eleanor, you're developing something unprecedented, the ability to help people heal by reconnecting them with the emotional power of their preserved experiences. Lucy's arrival interrupted their conversation, her arms full of college brochures and her face bright with excitement. The teenager had been accepted to several prestigious engineering programs, but she had decided to defer enrollment for a year to continue learning from Eleanor and documenting the memory keeper's capabilities. Mrs. Graves, I've been thinking about Mr. Kowalski's suggestion, Lucy announced, spreading her materials across the workshop table. What if we started a legitimate business? Graves Temporal Instruments, specializing in emotionally responsive timepieces. Frank chuckled at Lucy's entrepreneurial enthusiasm. You want to commercialize Eleanor's abilities? Not commercialize exactly, Lucy clarified. But think about it. Mrs. Graves is creating devices that genuinely help people heal from loss and trauma. Shouldn't this technology be available to anyone who needs it? Eleanor considered Lucy's proposal while continuing her work on the birthday watch. The girl's crystal face was taking shape beautifully, its faceted surface already beginning to resonate with the emotional frequencies Eleanor was embedding in its structure. Lucy, the danger isn't in helping people, Eleanor said carefully. The danger is in what might happen if the wrong people learn about the memory keeper's true capabilities. Herbert's machine represents a level of technological advancement that could fundamentally change human society. Herbert nodded gravely. Eleanor is right to be cautious. The memory keeper proves that consciousness can be preserved and transferred, that love generates measurable energy, that the boundary between life and death is far more permeable than anyone imagined. In the wrong hands, that knowledge could be catastrophic. Lucy's expression grew thoughtful. So we help people one at a time, quietly, without revealing the full scope of what's possible? Exactly, Eleanor replied. We use what we've learned to heal and comfort, but we protect the larger secret until humanity is ready for it. Frank stood up and moved to the workshop window, looking out at the garden where Eleanor's roses were preparing for winter dormancy. Eleanor, there's something else we should discuss. Word is getting around town about your remarkable timepieces. People are calling them miraculous, saying they provide comfort that seems almost supernatural. Eleanor felt a familiar flutter of concern. Are we attracting too much attention? Nothing dangerous yet, Frank assured her, but we should probably establish some kind of waiting list, maybe limit how many pieces you create each month. We don't want reporters or researchers showing up to investigate the miracle clockmaker of Millbrook. Herbert's projection smiled at the title. My darling, you've become exactly what I hoped you would, a bridge between the mechanical and the human, between past and future. But Frank is right about maintaining discretion. Eleanor finished the final adjustment on Lucy's birthday watch and held it up to catch the afternoon light. The crystal face sparkled with inner luminescence, and when she opened the back case, she could see the emotional resonance patterns she had embedded in its delicate mechanism. Patterns that would help Lucy access feelings of joy, confidence, and wonder whenever she needed them. "Lucy, this watch will be yours to keep, but also to study," Eleanor said, presenting the timepiece to the astonished teenager. "I want you to document everything, how it makes you feel, what memories it helps you access, how it changes your perspective on difficult days. Your observations will help us understand the long-term effects of emotional engineering." Lucy accepted the watch with reverent care, immediately feeling the warm pulse of its crystal face against her palm. "Mrs. Graves, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. It's also the most important responsibility you'll ever carry," Eleanor replied seriously. "You're going to be the first member of the next generation to grow up with access to preserved emotional experiences. I need you to help us understand what that means for the future of human development." Herbert moved to Eleanor's side, his projection solid and warm in the golden afternoon light. "Eleanor, you've created something remarkable here, not just individual healing devices, but a new approach to human emotional wellness. You're teaching people to preserve and access their most powerful feelings of love, hope, and connection." Eleanor looked around the workshop that had once been a shrine to grief and loss, now transformed into a place of creation and healing. The memory keeper hummed quietly in its corner, its crystal threads glowing with the patient light of a job well done. Frank sat contentedly in his chair, reading his newspaper while keeping watch over their small family. Lucy examined her new timepiece with the wonder of someone receiving their first glimpse of magic made real. "Herbert," Eleanor said softly, "I think we did it. We found a way to preserve love beyond death, to transform grief into something beautiful and useful." "We did more than that, my darling," Herbert replied, taking her hand in his warm, projected grasp. "We proved that love is the most powerful force in the universe, stronger than time, stronger than death, stronger than the boundaries between possible and impossible." The church bells began to chime 5 o'clock, their bronze voices mixing with the synchronized ticking of the clocks throughout Eleanor's house. But now, those sounds no longer marked the passage of empty time. They celebrated the rhythm of a life renewed, a love preserved, and a future bright with possibilities that no one had ever dared to imagine. Eleanor Graves was no longer a grieving widow. She was the guardian of humanity's most precious secret, that love, properly preserved and carefully tended, could bloom eternal in the marriage of heart and brass, memory and mechanism, human soul and clockwork precision. And in her small workshop, in Millbrook, surrounded by the gentle ticking of time itself, she continued the work that she and Herbert had begun together, proving that some things are indeed too beautiful and too important to ever let them die.